Well, good evening. Am I on? Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. Welcome to Wednesday Night Community. Thrilled that you chose to gather in the middle of the week like this. This is always fun. I so enjoy it. Quick announcement I want to make. I don't think this got into the bulletin, but this Saturday at 10 a.m. there's a men's event. We've arranged I don't know, is Neil Motley here? There you are. Okay, my man Neil. He's going to be our host, so if you have any questions, you can come see him afterwards. This is a private tour of Ken Kafka's legendary antique collection. I jumped online and was looking at some things. I mean, it's really unique things here. He's got an 18-inch railroad that he'll be operating, a small railroad museum housed in an actual wooden caboose behind an old Great Western Sugar Company steam locomotive, antique tractors. There's a restored 1918 Nash truck from World War I, totally restored. Just a lot of neat things like that. So Motley's have been out there many times. If you have questions, you can talk to them about it. Great thing, bring your son, grandson, whatever. A great opportunity, so hopefully you'll make use of that. We are in a series. This is week 8 in our series, The Bible That Jesus Read. And it's allowed us to really explore these two covenants, the two parts of our book, of our Bible, and see the interrelated nature of them, seeing that they're not quite as disparate as you might have thought. And last week we spent some time looking at why did Moses write the Torah? Hopefully you hear that some of these weeks kind of build on each other, but you can also pop in. So if you've missed any, jump online, please. But we looked at this idea of, did Moses write the Torah as an encouragement for the Hebrews to follow the Sinai law? And I said, no, I think there's something else going. I think he's writing this story to underscore that Israel can't be faithful to the law of Sinai. Therefore, something else beyond Sinai is needed to really address the issue that the law given at Sinai could show them that they were guilty, but it couldn't do anything about it. It couldn't clean them. Paul uses the example of the law is like a mirror. If you take out a mirror and you hold it up and you go, oh man, my face is dirty, and then you start wiping the mirror on your face, it's not going to clean, right? That's Paul's point. It can reveal that you're sinful. That's what the law does. The law is good, but it can't clean you. It can't fix the problem. And so that's kind of where we went a little bit last week. And I mentioned at the end that I wanted to come back and look at some of these 613 laws that come in different places throughout the Torah. But I want to pause that because I want to do a little bit of a different dive somewhere else that I think will be helpful. So we'll come back to that. If you're here just for that, I apologize. Different direction tonight. What I want us to do is and we're going to have kind of a case study here, okay? But I want us to look at how important it is for you to have the Old Testament in your mind when you read the New Testament. How much more helpful it will be. For instance, if you read through the Gospels and you've got the Old Testament in your mind, you're going to just pick up on things that you wouldn't otherwise pick up on. You'll read them differently. So tonight, we're going to read the whole Gospel of Matthew. Not literally, but we're going to go through the Gospel of Matthew. And I thought this is kind of a good case study because if you're here on the weekends, you remember what our series is on the weekends? Exodus, fire and cloud, right? We're looking at the life of Moses. So here's what I'm going to submit to you. If you have the life of Moses in your head and you read the Gospel of Matthew, you're just going to see new things that the author placed there because he's got it in his head. And so you might go, oh, I'm seeing whole new things in a Gospel of Matthew that I've read maybe 20 times, 30 times. And so this will be kind of our, like I said, our case study. Now, let me first show you the importance of why I think using the Old Testament to rightly understand the New, that's actually a New Testament emphasis. I'll give you an example. The book of Acts chapter 17, And in verse 10, Paul is traveling around. If you know the book of Acts, New Testament book of Acts, this is Paul the apostle. He's traveling around bringing the gospel to different places outside of Israel. He's the apostle to the Gentiles. So he's in Gentile territory oftentimes. But he always finds the local Jewish synagogue. And he starts there, then he goes to the marketplace where the Gentiles are. So he's just been in one of these Jewish synagogues. And we read this. This is Acts chapter 17, starting verse 10. We read, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, because they always get in trouble everywhere they go, so they've got to leave. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. This is interesting. Now, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. So they're praiseworthy. Why are they so praiseworthy? Well, here's the explanation. They received the word with all eagerness, but not until they examined the scriptures. And what are those? Old Testament. They examined the scriptures daily to fact check Paul. Do you see that? And the author Luke says the Bereans were more noble because they didn't just simply accept this New Testament teaching. They said, hold on. I'm going to double check and make sure this is accurate. They're using their Hebrew Bible to fact check and test Paul's message. And Luke goes, that's a really good thing. They're more noble than other groups because they're using the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, to make sure the New Testament is accurate. Now, you might object and say, well, sure, that's for them because there was no New Testament yet. We don't need to do that anymore. Well, how certain are you that your interpretation of the New Testament is accurate? You need to do the same. Let me give you one little example. This isn't something we'll dive into now, but here's just a common one that's oftentimes missed. If you've read the book of Romans, Ephesians, if you're like a theology nerd, you get to places where it talks about election. Have you heard that word before? Election has to do with salvation and, who are the elect and what does it mean to be elect and how do you get elect? And there's this huge argument around election. Okay? Here's what most people who have this argument completely miss. Paul didn't make up the word election. Guess where the concept election came from? Who's elect in the Old Testament? Israel. They are the elect people. So here's a big question. Does election mean salvation? Well, all Israel's elect. Are they all saved? Yeah. Remember the Exodus or the exile? There aren't Baal worshipers in heaven. A lot of these guys are Baal worshipers. Okay? Election does not equal salvation. So you've got to bring that understanding into, I'm going to wrestle with Romans and Ephesians, what is election, what's going on? Well, you better understand election from the Old Testament. Because does that make sense? You have to bring in these concepts and make sense of it there. So that's just one example that we're not talking about election tonight. That'll be another time. So the goal tonight is I want us to consider how and why the Old Testament is so important in understanding the New Testament. Let me give an illustration to kind of get us going. This might help. Think about how you watch movies. Think about like a trilogy or a series of movies, that kind of follow one another. And I want you to think of Matthew as like a movie. Okay? I'll give an example. Who's seen Star Wars? We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the original Star Wars, A New Hope, 1977. Hopefully, if you haven't seen Star Wars, you shouldn't be an American. I mean, you have to have seen Star Wars. That should be a requirement in the citizen test. If you think about the movie Star Wars, 1977, 38 years later, 2015, they made another one in the series, and that one was called The Force Awakens. Did you see this one? If you've seen The Force Awakens, here's an experience. If you know the original, here's the experience you probably had as you're watching The Force Awakens. Here's the story of the new one. There are secret plans to destroy a base. And so they're entrusted to or put inside a robot. And you might be going, sounds a lot like the 1977 story. Yeah, it is. It is. The storyline is very similar. In the original one, there's this guy named Luke Skywalker. He doesn't know who his parents are, and he's got a really weird, interesting relationship with this thing called the Force. In the new one, there's a girl named Rey. She doesn't know who her parents are. She's got a real weird, interesting relationship with this thing called the Force. The point is, the second movie functions in a way to make you think about the first movie. And you're supposed to think these things. What's similar, because that might be important, and what's different? That might be important. So as you watch these, you're supposed to see them as, yeah, they're kind of the same story, right? And so as I'm thinking of this new one, if I have the old one in my head, I sort of almost better understand the second one. Does that make sense? That's what I would submit to you the Old Testament is to the New Testament in many places, and we'll look at one example tonight. If you have the story of Moses, get it in your head, okay? And then we're going to look at Matthew, and you're going to start to go, that sounds a lot like the first movie, this second one here. So let's do this. Like I said, I want to look at the narrative of Matthew's gospel in light of the narrative of Moses' life and see some unique bridges here. So if you think about the book of Matthew, it kind of goes like this. Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the introduction of the story. Introduction, it sort of sets things up. 5 through about 25 is like the meat, the content, a lot of Jesus' teaching. And then 26 through 28, that's like the conclusion, the wrap-up, okay? So I want us to walk through just a couple of these chapters, see what we notice if we have Moses in our head, okay? Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. Let's kind of set this up. Matthew 1:1, we read this. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. You might think, why in the world do we need genealogies? They're so boring. Why would you? That's the worst way to start out a movie is by having that. Well, it's actually really important because if you go back to Adam's genealogy, this is Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, same language. This is the book of the generations of Adam, when God created man in his likeness and so on and that sort of thing. Why is it important to know Adam's genealogy? Well, do you remember back in the garden, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15? Something was said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, this is the serpent, between your seed, literally, and her seed. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Why is it important to know Adam's genealogy? Because it's important that we track the seed. The seed is going to be the serpent crusher. So we want to track this particular seed. That's why this is important. And this is what Matthew is doing. Is Matthew starting with the genealogy? Because he's saying, I'm tracking the same seed. This is important for the story, for our Star Wars story here. You need to know this seed as it's going. So Matthew chapter 1, genealogy, we're tracking on with the seed because it connects back to the original one, okay? Matthew chapter 2. Remember, the first 4 chapters are just introduction. Matthew chapter 2. What story do you have in your head, remember? Good, Moses, okay? Think about this. Matthew chapter 2. There's the birth of Jesus. There's a wicked king, Herod, who's trying to stop the birth, and he kills all boys 2 years and younger. Does it sound familiar? What's the first movie that you're thinking of? What are you tracking on? Yeah, sound familiar? Remember Pharaoh tried to kill all the boys? And in the midst of that, a savior named Moses is born. And the ancient reader is going to read this gospel and say, oh, of course, Jesus is like Moses. Okay, what else? Same chapter, chapter 2. Jesus has to go to Egypt to flee Herod. Why? Because we as the reader need to hear God brought his son up out of Egypt. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, the Exodus. So here's the summary. There's a genealogy, there's a birth, there's an attempt to kill, there's fleeing to Egypt, there's coming out of Egypt. What do you suppose might come next? Coming out of Egypt, and then before that, there's a narrative about water. Of course, that's one of the most important things in the Moses story. John's baptism. Jesus has to go through the waters of baptism, just like Moses went through the waters of the Red Sea. Leaving there. Summary, Jesus comes up out of Egypt, chapter 2. He goes through the waters, chapter 3. What might come next? Yeah. Chapter 4, Jesus is led out into the wilderness. And what do you suppose might happen while he's out there? Is he going to be tested? Yeah. Israel was tested constantly in the wilderness, and we know how that turned out. So he goes out there for 40 days. And you're supposed to go, this sounds really familiar. Just like Israel, 40 years in the wilderness. But unlike Israel, Jesus passes all the temptations, all the tests. There's the similar, dissimilar. That's the intro to Matthew, chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you have that Moses story in your head, you're reading this, you're being set up like you are in the Star Wars films. Oh, I see what's going on here. Chapter 5. We get into Matthew chapter 5. This is the middle of the book. This gets into the meat of it. And Jesus is presented not just as a redeemer, but he's presented as a teacher. It's a huge emphasis here. Jesus, the teacher. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. This is how it sets it up. This is how the chapter starts. Matthew 5, 1. Seeing the crowds, he went up on a mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. What does that sound like? Someone who goes up on a mountain to dispense knowledge, truth, to teach. Yeah, it sounds exactly like Sinai. When we get there, he goes up on a mountain, and then what Matthew does something interesting. He records in sort of the middle part, he picks 5 sermons that Jesus gave. Think about this. 5 sermons. Jesus spoke lots of things. In fact, the Apostle John says, if I wrote down all the things that Jesus said, I suppose not all the books in the world could contain it. So Matthew very specifically chooses 5 teachings, and he puts them all in, they're called discourses. Sermon on the Mount is 1. Missionary discourse, 2. Parable discourse, 3. Discourse on the church, 4. And discourse on the last days. And here's what I want you to see. At the end of each one of these 5 that he selects, Matthew does something real specific. He puts in some specific language. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:28, he writes this, and when Jesus finished these sayings, I think the crowds or whatever, in the missionary discourse, Matthew chapter 11, at verse 1, the very end of it, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there. Third one, the parable discourse, Matthew 13:53. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went on from there, blah, blah, blah. The parable on the church, Matthew 19:1, this is how it ends. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee. And then the last one, number 5, the discourse on the last days, Matthew 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you see the pattern, yes? It's interesting. Moses, who delivered his teachings, when it says he got to the very end, it said, when Moses had finished writing the words of the law in the book to the very end. This is a tagline that's unique for Moses writing scripture and Torah. And Matthew intentionally picks 5 books. He tags Moses' kind of line at the end of each of these 5 sections. Now, why did Matthew pick 5? What's the significance of 5? 5 books in the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The 5 books of Moses, as they're called. And he picks 5 teachings of Jesus and tags a Moses line at the end of each one. Do you see what he's saying here? This is Jesus giving his Torah. This is Jesus giving his teaching. The reader's like, oh, it's like we're sitting at the bottom of Mount Sinai. And Torah is coming to us. Then you think of the conclusion of the book. Kind of as an example, in Exodus chapter 19, Moses goes up the mountain. He receives the law. And do you know how it's finished? It's finished in Exodus chapter 24, verse 3. We read this. Moses came and told the people all the words of Yahweh and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, and they said, all the words of Yahweh has spoken to us, we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. The 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of Israel, of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to Yahweh. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half of the blood and threw it against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant, and he read it in their hearing of people. And they said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. We will be obedient. Moses took the blood, he threw it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that Yahweh has made with you in accordance with all these words. What has Moses just done? They've entered in, he's initiated a covenant. Okay? He's initiated a covenant between God and the people. So at the end of the story of Moses, you can think of the first movie, all these things happen. They go to the mountain, and then a covenant is made between the people and the Lord. Well, guess what's going to happen when we come back to Matthew? The conclusion of Matthew starts in chapter 26. Jesus sits with his 12 apostles. He's just finished giving his 5th and final discourse, the last teaching. And as soon as he's done with it, he sits down with the 12 apostles, and we read this. Matthew chapter 26, verse 1. When Jesus had, remember the phrase? When he had finished all of his teachings, last just like Moses, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Let me go down to verse 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread. And after blessing it, broke it, he gave it to his disciples. He said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. For this is my exact same phrase that comes from the Deuteronomy passage or Exodus passage that Moses said. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Remember, thrown against the altar, it's poured out. I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. He makes a covenant. Do you see what Matthew is wanting the careful reader to see? This Jesus is a redeemer, yes. He's a teacher, yes. but he's also a covenant maker. So again, this profile is building on who exactly he is. He's a covenant maker, but through his own blood. And then it's interesting, when we come to closer to the very end, Matthew chapter 28, Jesus dies, he's buried, he defeats death, and he goes and he stands on a mountain. And this is what takes place there, very end of Matthew's movie. Matthew chapter 28, verse 16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came to them and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So what's interesting here, and this is an important reality, Jesus is standing in Israel, right? He's standing in Israel, and he's telling them to go out of Israel, all the world, ends of the world, right? Okay, have that in your head because we're going to compare the two movies. He's on a mountain, standing in Israel, telling them to go outside of Israel. Let's go to that last mountain that Moses went to. Deuteronomy chapter 34. We read this, verses 1 through 4. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And Yahweh showed him all the land, Gilead as far north as Dan and Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, the plain that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And Yahweh said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. People go over and Moses dies. The Lord buries him. Here's what I want us to see. Moses stands on a mountain outside of Israel, telling Israel to go in and acquire the land where his name will dwell. You see that? He's standing outside Israel, telling them to go into Israel and acquire the land where God's name is going to dwell. Think of the contrast. Jesus stands inside Israel, telling them to go out to acquire hearts where his name will dwell. Let's go back to the Star Wars kind of example here. When you have these in your head, you see parallels, right? Oh, these are really, really similar. It's like kind of tracking on the same story, but they're not exactly the same. There are like key places where they're different. And so I get insight from the parallels, but I get just as much insight from the differences. If the story's tracking along the same way and then all of a sudden one thing doesn't match, you go, why is that? Well, maybe the director, the producer of the film wants you to really think about that. Maybe that's a super important part of the movie, that one thing twisted. Oh, I thought I knew the whole story, but all of a sudden there was a twist to it. That twist must be different. This brings us to the punchline of Matthew. Matthew is not, or the importance of it, the punchline, it's not in how Jesus is similar to Moses. I mean, that's important because you're supposed to track and then find the things that are dissimilar. It's how it's different. Listen to Jesus' words. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 26. Now think carefully about what he's saying here. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. He writes this. This is in the midst of his teaching section, those 5 teachings. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be category 1. They will be a wise man, like one who built his house on rock. Rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them, category 2, 2 kinds of people, will be a fool, like a foolish man, who built his house on the sand. Rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. It's interesting. These words of mine will determine which camp you're in, wise or foolish. Do you know how the Torah ends? The Torah ends, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you 2 categories, life and death, blessing and curse. 2 categories. You can be one of 2 different kinds of people. Sounds familiar? Therefore, choose category 1, life. Choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving Yahweh your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give. Do you see the parallels here? 2 paths. There's life and there's death. And whose words are they? They're God's words. When Jesus says it, those who listen to my words, 2 paths, life and death, the wise person and the foolish person. See, put Jesus' words in the mouth of any other Old Testament prophet. Isaiah says, if you listen to my words, you will be saved. Or even Moses, listen to my words. What would be the response if you put Jesus' words in any prophet in the Old Testament? We'd stone them for blasphemy. They would be committing, your eternal destiny depends upon how you respond to what I think and what I say. And you just go, that's so arrogant if you're just a human, if you're merely a human. But it's not arrogant if you are the Most High God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And we've seen in this series how it is that Jesus continually identifies with, I'm the visible Yahweh. That's me. How is it that Matthew does it? He does it in a beautifully intelligent way, rather than just saying Jesus is God. He does it in this way that allows, like a good movie. Movie doesn't start with the end. It just tell you, oh yeah, everyone dies in the end. It's a tragedy. No, it builds. It wants you to track along with it. It wants you to enter the story and begin evaluating the story from within, placing yourself as a character into the story. That's what Matthew does. He's an intelligent writer. And yet Matthew records Jesus as saying this based on who he is. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 and 30. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden, it's light. In the ancient world, a teacher's yoke was their Torah, their instruction. He's saying, take my teaching, learn my ways, and you'll find rest. Are you exhausted? Maybe you feel guilt because you don't measure up. You do break the Sinai law and covenant, and you feel guilt from that, and you know there's no real relief of it. I have a yoke which is light. It'll give you rest. It won't be about you checking all these boxes. My yoke is different. My teaching is different. And then he says, learn from me. I remember Dallas Willard. Some of you might know who he is. He was a brilliant, he was the head of the Department of Philosophy at USC, I think, in California. Passionate follower of Jesus. Toward the end of his life, wrote a lot of books on spiritual formation and contemplation and all these sorts of things. Loved Jesus. And he would talk about this passage, learn from me. And he says, you know what? I've started this practice. I get to the end of my day, and I say, did I learn anything from you today, Jesus? And he goes, because I realized that wasn't my focus and my goal most of the time. It just wasn't my attention. I didn't learn anything from Jesus today. I don't mean content like memorizing passages. I'm saying learn something about what does it mean to submit a little bit more? What does it mean to be quicker to ask forgiveness, quicker to offer forgiveness? Did I learn anything from Jesus today? That's a great question. I have to admit, I fail to ask that question all the time, because when I do, I oftentimes go, no, I didn't. I want that to be, I want to learn from Jesus the easy way of doing life, his yoke, his Torah. I want to have his Torah upon my life. Now, here's the last kind of punchline for our movie, okay? If you've ever seen a movie, sometimes you get to the very end, like the last scene, and something happens that makes you go, oh, that was like alluded to like the very first scene. You know what I mean by that? And all of a sudden, like, I see why they put this at like minute 2 and this at 2 hours. Because they sort of, these two things frame the whole story. Okay? Let's look how Matthew frames his movie. It's so good. Matthew does it like this. So we learn from his story. Yes, Jesus is a prophet like Moses. Yes, he's a redeemer like Moses. Yes, he does miracles like Moses. But there's a difference. Remember, the difference is the important part. There's a difference. Well, let's go back to page 1. Matthew chapter 1, verse 22. We read this. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name, what is it? Emmanuel. And then we're told which means God with us, okay? Store that away. God with us. This isn't his name. His name's Jesus. This is his identity, okay? This is, speaking of his identity here, he begins with Jesus' identity. God with us. Go to the very last page of Matthew. Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, here's the end. The credits are coming. Behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. God with us is with us always. Just page 1 on the last page, you're supposed to see these things as connecting. That Matthew frames this entire account, this narrative of who Jesus is, with this concept of he's God with us and he's with you always. And I think that's what the producer of this movie wants you to take away. Many things, but the last thing he wants you to take away is that God with us is with us always. That's how we go out into our world. That's how we handle the difficult call from the doctor. That's how we deal with the broken relationship, is that I'm not alone doing life. Instead, the God who's with us, he's with me always, even to the end of the age. And we're in the age. He's with us through the end, through the absolute dark end even. God's with us. That's an amazing story, isn't it? And we see how it comes alive through having the story of Moses, the movie 1, in our head. When we get to this one, all of a sudden we see new layers, we see things going on, and we realize the Old Testament is beautiful because it illuminates things I just don't see myself. And it tells me this is the God who says, I'm going to be with you. I'm utterly committed to being with you, and I will be with you always. And every time you take this, you're sort of talking to yourself. You're proclaiming to yourself this truth, that I have a God who is so insistent upon being with me. He takes on flesh. He lives a perfect human life, fully human. He dies in my place. He defeats death. He rescues me in the future from the grave. And he says, I'm going to come and be with you so that you can come and be with me. As C.S. Lewis says, God became man. The Son of God became man that men might become sons and daughters of God. It's the great exchange. And so we proclaim it, we remind ourselves, and we proclaim it to the world that Christ has died for us, he has risen, and because of that I have entrance into the Most High God. Amen? Here's what I want us to do during this next song. You just sit with Jesus for the next minute or two. Listen, ask him to speak, see what he might say to you. And then after the song, I want us to take the elements together.